A good afternoon to you and greetings in the name of the Lord, and welcome to another short session of Ask the Pastor Bible Study Live. And I call it short because it will have to be short, at least for this session, because in about 45 minutes, I will be going to pick up my children from school, and so that cannot be delayed. So I this is actually going to be a good one because it's limited by that time, because I tend to go over on the hour. So want to discuss covenants and covenant lawsuits. Covenants and covenant lawsuits in the context of the Bible. I'm going to ask that as you come in, please hit that share button on my behalf. That way, I don't have to spend most of my time trying to do that, but I will share it with a few groups that I am familiar with. Now, every Christian is aware or should be aware that the Bible is a book of covenants. So it should go without saying that the Bible is a book of covenants. The Bible is not a history book. The Bible is not a science book. The Bible is not even a law book or a book for counseling or any of those kind of things. But those things can be found within the context of the Bible. So you'll find historical records, you'll find legal records, you will find counseling, wisdom type literature within the Bible. You'll find prophecies, predictions of the future, and so on and so forth. However, the Bible is a book of the covenants between God and humans, and more specifically, between God and Israel and the surrounding nations that surrounded Israel. So therefore, when we look at the Bible, we must understand that the context of the Bible is the covenant context from Genesis to Revelation. Everything in the Bible must be viewed in its covenant context. The moment you stop viewing the Bible as a covenant book, and the moment you start seeing the different writings and the different records as related to the covenant, that is the moment you start misquoting, misinterpreting, and simply just going off the chains with the Bible. And so it is important to see, and indeed, throughout the history of the church, many scholars have come to discover that the Bible is a book of covenants. The translators of the Bible divided it into two: the Old Covenant or the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, of course, we must say from the onset that the division of the two testaments is not strictly accurate. The division of the two testaments is not strictly accurate. In other words, the Old Testament does not end in verse 5 of Malachi 4. And the New Testament does not begin in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. So the divisions are not accurate, they are more generic. Now, having said that, it is important to understand that the covenants of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, are structured in a specific, precise way. The covenants of the Bible are structured in a specific, precise way that can be studied and that can be mastered and that can be understood. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you two presentations on PowerPoint that are going to explain the covenant of the Bible. And then in the next session, I'm going to begin to do what is called the covenant lawsuits. But let me just kind of give an overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you what the covenants of the Bible are and how they are structured. And then I'm going to show you that once the covenant is established, then God begins to send covenant ambassadors either to teach people the meaning of the covenant, or most of the time to begin what is called a covenant lawsuit. In other words, the covenant has been made, but unfortunately, the covenant has been broken. And because the covenant has been broken, then a Jeremiah is sent to bring forth a covenant lawsuit to prove that God has a case against his covenant people and to justify the actions that he's going to take. So when you're reading Isaiah, Isaiah is presenting a covenant lawsuit. When you're reading Jeremiah, Jeremiah is presenting a covenant lawsuit. Obadiah, Amos, Malachi, every single one of them is going to bring a covenant lawsuit. In other words, they're going to present a case of how the covenant already established has been broken. The same thing happens in the New Testament. The same thing happens in the New Testament. And in the New Testament, we have one book that is actually a covenant lawsuit, which is the book of Revelation. In other words, a covenant has been established, the covenant has been broken, and a lawsuit is going to be raised based on that covenant. But before we get there, let's first of all learn what a covenant is, so that when we study the covenant lawsuits, then they will begin to make sense and you'll begin to see them clearly for what they are. So here we go. Covenants in the ancient Near East. Covenants in the ancient Near East. Now, this particular presentation was designed and written by Sheila E. McGinn, PhD, and we are going to utilize it for our purposes, the first 8 pages of it anyway. So here we go. Now, what is a covenant? What is a covenant? According to the Old Testament peoples, according to the people of the Bible and the surrounding nations, a covenant is a formal agreement between two parties. A covenant is a formal agreement between two parties, and a covenant is often witnessed by both humans and deities. So humans and God, humans and angels, humans and various gods of the Old Testament. Okay. Now, a covenant often or always is proclaimed by public reading and then by a deposit of the treaty in a public place. For instance, a shrine of witnessing deities, a temple, and so on and so forth. Again, with the Old Testament covenants, even in the Sumerian and Mesopotamian English, history, you will find that a covenant is sealed by an oath and a ritual sacrifice. And often it is in this form. They will cut animals by half, and then the two parties to the covenant will walk between the two halves of the animals that have been slaughtered, and they will declare, the oath will be, if I'm not faithful to this covenant, may what is done to these animals be done to me. So I want to remind you, for instance, if you go to Genesis, I believe it's about Genesis 15, 16 there. God makes a covenant with Abraham, right? And in the covenant, Abraham is told to slaughter animals and then to lay the halves on each side. And then Abraham is put to sleep. And then the Spirit of God goes through the animals, in the middle between the animals. And what God is saying is, if I'm not faithful to this covenant, let what has been done to these animals be done to me. So this was a very common aspect of the Old Testament covenants. Now, continuing, there were 3 kinds of covenants found in the ancient Near East. So the ancient Near East is the old covenant environment. There are 3 kinds of covenants. The number 1 type of covenant is what is called a suzerainty or a vassal treaty. A suzerainty or a vassal treaty. It is an agreement between 2 unequal parties, one of higher status and one of lower status. A suzerainty or a vassal treaty is an agreement between 2 parties who are not of the same class. One is superior to the other, one is inferior to the other. And then another type of covenant that is found in the ancient Near East is what is called a parity treaty or a parity covenant. It is an agreement between 2 parties of equal status. So these are on the same level. None is greater than the other. And then the third type of covenant that we see in the ancient Near East and in the Bible is what is called a land grant. It is an agreement between 2 unequal parties. one of higher status, one of lower status. So you can see that a land grant and a suzerainty have some similarities, but we will go into it deeper and we'll see why they are not exactly equivalent. But both a suzerainty and a land grant means that one of the parties is superior to the others. Okay, now let's continue here so that we can see the differences. Now, a suzerainty, which is the most common type of, excuse me, guys. All right, there we go. The most common type of treaty is what is called a suzerainty. This is what the Old Covenant is like. The Old Covenant is a suzerainty vassal treaty. It has 6 parts. It has what is called a preamble, a historical prologue, stipulations, provisions for treaty deposit and public reading, a list of divine witnesses to the treaty, blessings and curses for fidelity or infidelity to the treaty. A suzerainty vassal is an alliance between a great monarch and a subject king. It was always between a great monarch, he himself being a king. In other words, it's an alliance between a king of kings and the kings of the king. The overlord, the monarch, is lauded for past favors, but has no explicit duties or requirements under the covenant. The vassal pledges allegiance to the overlord. He pledges to pay taxes, to keep his own borders secure, to provide military support against the overlord's enemies, and to make no alliances with other great lords. So he's only to have one lord. One of the most common suzerainty treaties or covenants in the Old Testament was marriage. Marriage is the most common type of this type of covenant. A husband is the overlord. A husband is the overlord. He has a higher social status than a wife. That is in the Old Covenant. In the Old Covenant, the husband was always greater than the wife. The husband is the wife's overlord. He's called the Baal. The wife is to obey the husband. The wife becomes chattel of the husband. The wife owns no property. It belongs to the husband. The wife cannot divorce the husband. Only the husband can divorce the wife. The other type of covenant that you find in the Bible and in the Old Testament is what is called a parity treaty. A parity treaty is two parties who are of equal power and social status. For instance, two kings, two monarchs forming an alliance for mutual aid. So in other words, we are equal to each other. Let's form an alliance that we will help each other out when we are in trouble. But I'm not greater than you. You're not greater than me. Another type of parity treaty in the Old Testament, two merchants forming a trade agreement. A marriage contract between the father of the bride and the groom. A marriage contract, which is called a ketubah, between the father of the bride and the groom. Note, the bride herself is not of equal status with the groom. So in other words, whenever they would make marriage contracts, for instance, when Abraham makes a marriage contract for his son Isaac, he and Bethuel, or he and so Bethuel and Isaac are considered to be on the same level. But Rebekah, the wife of Isaac, is not on the same level as her father, nor is she on the same level as her husband. She is property. She is to serve her husband, and so on and so forth. Hopefully that makes sense. So right now, I'm just kind of making distinctions because later on, we will actually go to the biblical texts that show how these contracts work or these covenants work. Because this is going to help us to understand the covenant between Christ and his church. And this is going to help us to understand the New Testament, New Covenant better. because a new covenant is a type of these covenants that we are looking at right now. So let's continue just a little bit further. The last page here, the third type of covenant is called a land grant. This is different from a suzerainty. This is different from a parity contract or parity treaty. This is called a land grant. It is a free gift of land to a faithful subject of a great monarch or the servant of a wealthy landowner. So it's a free gift of land. The greater party binds himself to the treaty. The lesser party benefits from the gift, but may not be bound to any specific stipulations, either before or after the reception of the land grant. Okay, so for instance, with the land grant, Genesis 12 is a land grant. Genesis 12 is a land grant in which God is greater than Abraham. Abraham is inferior to God, but Abraham is not required to do anything. God says, I have found favor in you. I like you. I want to bless you. So I'm going to bless you. You don't have to do anything about it. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you land. I'm going to give you land. It's a land grant. There are no stipulations. It doesn't say that, Abraham, if you walk like this or if you do this, then I'll give you the land. No, it's just a simple, unconditional gift. Okay. Whereas when you go a little bit later down the line, you find God making a vassal suzerainty treaty with the nation of Israel. And we shall look at the specific scriptures in a little while. So let's do this. In fact, let's go on to another slide here that is going to give us some of the same points, but in a maybe a more detailed way. So let's go through this and see what we shall learn. So a covenant, like we already seen, is a treaty, is an agreement. It's a formal agreement between two or more parties. It has mutual benefit. It has mutual responsibility in general. Okay. Now, the Hittite treaties of the Old Testament are what helps us to understand what was happening in the Old Testament. Usually, the Hittites, who are in Asia Minor and Turkey, made treaties with Egypt, and they were written in the Akkadian language, the language of Mesopotamia. It was the language of the day. So this is the Hittites made two types of treaties. They did not make land grants as such. So they made the parity treaty, which we have already seen. It means that the two are on par, and they made the vassal treaties. The two are unequal parties. Now, the inferior, in a vassal suzerainty treaty, the inferior was bound by oath to the superior. And in the covenant language, the superior would be called the great king. The mutual obligation would be there, but obedience of the vassal is given greater weight than the opposite. So therefore, the greater king does have some things that he says, I will do this for you, I will protect you. But the greater weight in the covenant is the obedience of the vassal. Then the stipulations are laid on the vassal, never on the great king. Promises to help the vassal are made, but they are simply that, promises. They are promises. They are not legal stipulations. They are not legal requirements on the great king. They are simply promises, and they are to be taken on the basis of trust and on the basis of goodwill. Okay. So in other words, if you think about it, you think about the covenants of God. For instance, the Old Testament covenant of God and Israel. God says, I am your God. So Exodus chapter 20, I am your God. You shall have no other gods before me, and so on and so forth. Then he says, you shall not steal, you shall not do this, you shall not do that. But notice that in the text, God promises to do certain things, but God is not bound by those things. There is no stipulations against God that God, if you don't do this, you will die. If you don't do this, you because there's no such things on God. He promises to do good. He promises to bring protection. He promises to bless. But the promises are simply just that, promises. but the obedience of the people is a legal requirement. And if they don't obey, there are very dire consequences to the stipulations. So going on a little bit further, what is the theological significance of these covenants? Israel is related to Yahweh in legal covenantal terms throughout the history of Israel. Throughout, even the church is related to God through legal covenant terms. God is the great king of the Bible. Israel is the vassal nation of God. It was an important start of the Israel monarchy, for instance, in Judges 8:23. We're not going to look at that right now, but here are the 6 parts of an Old Testament covenant. All the Old Testament covenants in the Bible have all of these 6 elements, or at the very least, some of these 6 elements. What are they? Number 1, the preamble. The preamble is where the parties to the covenant are identified. The preamble is where the parties to the covenant are identified. These are the words, for instance, here is a Hittite preamble. These are the words of the son, Suppiluliumas, the great king, the king of the land of the Hittites, the valiant, the favorite of the storm god. So this is actually a covenant that was made between one of the kings of the Hittites, who is called Suppiluliumas, who calls himself the son. And he will say, I am the king of these people. So you see this in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, where God begins by saying, and actually this one I'll read to you. So compare this with what we just read there about the Hittite king. And remember that the Hittite king, his covenant was made before Exodus. So it's older than Exodus. So in other words, the writer of Exodus or God is using what was already known about how to relate with the people. So let's go to Exodus chapter number 20. Exodus chapter number 20 and verse number 2. Listen to what it says. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of Israel, out of the house of slavery. So this is a preamble. You also find this in Deuteronomy chapter 1, from verse 1 to verse 5. Listen to what it says. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the Arabah, opposite Suf, between Parao and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 40th year of the first month of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him commandment to them. After he had defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and in Erdei, beyond the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain this law, saying, the Lord, our God, said to us in Horeb, and so on and so forth. So this is a preamble. In other words, this is going to set up the explanation of why there is a covenant. First of all, I am the great king, I am the great Lord, I am the majestic king, and you are my servants. And I have demonstrated already what kind of a king I am. I delivered you from your enemies. I delivered you from, and he will name the enemies, so that the vassal knows how they arrived at that position of being in covenant with whatever great king is being presented. Now, the second part, which is immediately after the introduction of the parties of the covenant, is a historical prologue. And a historical prologue will be the previous relationship between the parties. Why is it necessary that we enter into a covenant? That's the question that is being answered. Previously, for instance, now this is a quotation from that earlier Hittite covenant. It says, previously the king of Egypt and his cronies were hostile to the son, but you parted from them and you joined with me. So you will see the same things in Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 1, or Joshua 24, where God says, Previously, the Egyptians were holding you captive. Previously, the Moabites were holding you captive. Previously, the Babylonians were holding you captive. However, once I delivered you from them, you came under my jurisdiction. So he will tell the story of how they got there. So that whoever is reading that covenant years down the line, descendants, they will understand how the covenant came to be and why it's important that they remain in covenant, because there was a deliverance, there was a victory, there was a fight. And if it had not been for me, you guys would still be in slavery, you guys would still be in trouble. So that's why you have to give a historical prologue. The next part of the covenant is the stipulations. The stipulations, here is an example from the Hittite covenant. He who lives in peace with the son, remember the son is the king of the Hittites. He who lives in peace with the son lives at peace with you. But he who is an enemy to the son is an enemy to you. No foreign relationships are allowed, only one covenant. No enemies amongst the vassals. You must respond to the call to arms. You must have lasting loyalty to the king. So the point of this is this, guys. Understand this, that what we see in the Bible is not unique in and of itself. It's not the only. So in other words, when we read the Bible, we are not reading something that was new and unseen before when God showed up to the people of Israel. Rather, when God comes to the people of Israel, he makes covenants with them that they are already familiar with in their history and in the nations that surround them. So that the only thing that is different in the Bible is that whereas the nations surrounding Israel had the same type of writings, such as Israel, and the same type of wordage, same type of laws, for the most part, the nations surrounding Israel and that preceded Israel in history had many gods, they had many altars, and they had many relationships with the different gods. So, what was unique about the God of Israel is that he came and said, I will not allow any other gods. There is only one God, and you cannot have any relationship with any other God whatsoever. Whereas the other nations did allow people to actually interchange the gods. So sometimes they would be worshiping Ashtoreth, at other times they would be worshiping Baal. They could interchange many of the times. So this is what is different about God. For him, there is only one God. All the other gods are nothing. They are false. They are fake. They are counterfeit. They are not to be worshipped in any way. They are not to be submitted to in any format. Okay. Now let's continue. So the stipulations are very general and sometimes they are very specific. Let's move on. We see the stipulations, for instance, in Exodus. I'm going to go back here to Exodus. In fact, let's do the one in Deuteronomy. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 5, you will begin to see the stipulations that God begins to give the people of Israel. So I'll read the first few verses. Here it says, and Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to obey them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb, not with our fathers did the Lord make his covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke to you or with you face to face at the mountain out of the midst of the fire. You shall have no other gods before me, verse number 7. You shall not make for yourselves carved images, verse number 8. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, verse number 9. I'm kind of just skipping as I go along. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, verse 11. Verse 12, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Verse 14, let's go to verse 15. You shall remember that you are a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So he will have all these stipulations. And in fact, the stipulations for the vassal treaty between God and Israel stretches from Deuteronomy chapter 5 up to Deuteronomy chapter 6. All the things that God requires Israel to fulfill before they can even begin to speak about whether he will bless them or whether he will curse them. So in other words, the third section here is the ethical requirements. What must you do as a vassal? What must you do as a subject of God? Okay. Then the fourth part of covenants in the Old Testament is curses and blessings. Curses and blessings. So, for instance, here are two examples. Here are two examples of how these statements were made amongst the Old Testament kings and their subjects outside of the Bible. So here is one of them. May Ashur, king of the gods, decree for you an evil and propitious fate and not grant you fatherhood and old age. Does that sound familiar? You will have premature death. You will die before your time. Here is another one. May Ninurta fell you with his fierce arrow and fill the plain with your corpses and give your flesh to eagles and vultures to feed on. Does any of this sound familiar to anyone? So remember, this is from the Hittites. These are the records that have been found in archaeological records of the Hittites, the Sumerians, the people of Mesopotamia in the ancient Near East. And generally, most of these writings are much older than the Bible. This is the point I want to make. That when you are reading the Bible, you are not reading literature that is any different from the literature that you will find in the Middle East at the same period of time. So, like for instance, where we just read here that Ninurta fell you with his fierce arrow and fill the plain with your corpses and give your flesh to eagles and vultures to feed on. And here is one last one. May all your teeth fall out except one, and may it be abscessed. Right? Let me give you an example of these blessings and curses in the Bible. In the Bible, so it will sound very similar. It sound very similar in times of making the covenant. So, for instance, let's do Jeremiah chapter 7, just for comparison purposes. So look at what Jeremiah chapter 7 will do. And Jeremiah chapter 7 is actually a covenant lawsuit. But I will go to the very end, and I want you to compare what I just showed you there concerning corpses being filled in a valley. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, the Lord says, declares the Lord, when it will no more be called Topheth or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they will bury in Topheth because there is no room elsewhere. And the dead bodies of these people will be food for the birds of the air and for the beasts of the earth, and none will frighten them away. And I will silence in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, for the land shall become a waste. Compare that with what I just showed you here. May Ninurta of the Hittites fell you with his fierce arrow and fill the plain, the valley, with your corpses. Give your flesh to eagles and vultures to feed on. May all your teeth fall out except one, and may it be abscessed. Okay, so you see curses and blessings, for instance, in the Bible in Exodus chapter 23, verse 20 to 33, Deuteronomy chapter 27, all the way to Deuteronomy chapter number 30, and as I've already indicated with Jeremiah, blessings and cursings are the basis for the message of the prophets. This is very important to understand, that when you are reading the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament prophets, what you are reading is a person who has been sent because the original covenant has already been broken. And now they are here to tell the people that the curses and the blessings that were promised long ago are now about to fall on you in the near future. This is the basis of every single prophetic writing. In other words, the prophets cannot be understood without understanding the covenant at hand. So whenever you see a prophecy, there is a legal framework for that prophecy. There is a covenant that was already established in the well-known pattern. And what is the well-known pattern? We have already seen that the well-known pattern that was already established throughout the Old Testament. First, every covenant would have a preamble. A preamble is where the parties to the covenant are identified. I am the Lord your God, you are my people, so on and so forth. Here, the example that is given is the relationship between the son Suppiluliumas and the land of the Hittites. Okay, you go on a little bit further. There is a historical prologue. How did we get to be in covenant? What is the historical narrative that brought us to this place? Then the third part of it, what are the ethical stipulations? What are the requirements? What do I need to do as the inferior in order to remain in covenant with the superior? Loyalty to the king, respond to arms, do not kill, do not do this. And so those are the stipulations. Then what if I don't keep the stipulations? There's going to be curses and blessings. So we see this one from Ashur, we see this one from Ninurta, and so on and so forth. And we see that very same thing in Deuteronomy and in Exodus chapter number 23. In fact, why don't we read, if you don't mind, we are going to read Deuteronomy, Exodus 23, actually, Exodus 23, because it's a shorter one. Deuteronomy would be too long. So Exodus 23, and we are going to begin from verse number 20. So look at this. So this is a declaration of blessing and curses if the covenant is not kept. Watch this. Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and the Hittites, we've been reading about the Hittites, and the Perizzites and the Canaanites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I blot them out, you shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do as they do, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness away from you. None shall miscarry or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. I will send my terror before you. I will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come. I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild animals multiply against you. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and you possess the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So this is what is called the blessings and the curses section of a covenant. And every biblical covenant has it. The blessings and the curses section. So when we understand how the covenants are structured, then we are able to read the Bible in its proper context. What am I reading? Am I reading a preamble? Am I reading a historical prologue? Am I reading an ethical stipulation of the covenant? Am I reading the consequences of breaking the covenant? Or, as we shall see here, what is the next part? The fifth one is the fifth part of a biblical covenant and an Old Testament covenant in the ancient Near East is there has to be a depository for the covenant. Where shall I find the covenant when I want to see it? Where shall the covenant be found? Where is it deposited? What to do with the finished covenant document? So we see, for instance, Deuteronomy 31 from verse 9 to 13. Deuteronomy 31 from verse 9 to 13. So this is the how shall we store the covenant for future generations? Okay. So for instance, let's go back here. Let's go to Deuteronomy 31. Deuteronomy chapter 31. Deuteronomy chapter 31. And we want to begin at verse number 9 to verse number 13. So look at how they will treat it. So they will say, then Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release, at the feast of booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, little ones, the sojourner within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of this law, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, as long as you live in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. So this is called the succession part, the succession part of the covenant. In other words, how does the covenant pass from generation to generation? How does the covenant pass from generation to generation? Let me ask you this. When you think about the new covenant, and the declaration of the new covenant, how does the new covenant pass from generation to generation? Under the old covenant, every 7 years they had to read it. Every 7 years they had to read it. So that whoever was born when it was first read, they would be 7 years old when it was read again to the whole nation. The next time it was read, they would be 14 years old. The next time it is read, they would be 21 years old. How is the new covenant sustained from generation to generation? I want you to think about that when I come for the second session, when we will begin to look at the actual practical fulfillment of this and how it was handled by the prophets and then by the apostles and then by the writer of Revelation, because they are all writing in the same context. You have to understand that Revelation is a covenant document. I hope that as I've been going through this, the moment you think about Revelation, you begin to think, wait a minute, there is a preamble in Revelation, right? Chapter 1 is a preamble. There is a historical prologue. How did we get here? Chapter 2 and 3 and 4. How did we get here? He talks to the church of Ephesus, what has happened, what took place, how we got where we are. He talks to 7 churches about how they got to where they are. And now judgment is about to begin because certain things have been neglected, certain things have been broken. So Revelation follows the pattern of the Old Testament covenants. But you see, if you don't already know that there is a specific pattern that is being followed every single time, by the time you get to Revelation, you're just thinking it's a story of, I don't know what, helicopters, locusts, funny things. You're not paying attention to the structure. there is a pattern. And that is what I'm trying to communicate here. So that once you begin to see the pattern, when you go to the book of Acts, you'll see it. When you go to Ephesians, you'll see it. When you go to Matthew, you'll understand what is being done there in terms of the covenant. Jesus came to establish a covenant. A covenant must be established in a specific, precise pattern. That's the point. Last thing that I'm going to show here. Then I'm going to have to run for the moment anyway. And then I'll be back for part number 2. Let's finish here. Number 6, part number 6. Remember, there are 6 parts to a covenant in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Witnesses. There must be witnesses. In the Old Testament Hittite form, it would be deities, gods, who are to bring about the blessings and curses. The treaty which he has made binding, so this is a type of a covenant that was made. Witnesses, they would say something like this: the treaty which he, the particular God, has made binding with you before Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, Mercury, Mars, and Sirius, before Ashur and Lil, Ea, and Marduk, and so on and so forth. Witnesses. Who are the witnesses? Think about it, guys. Does Revelation speak about witnesses? And where does it speak about witnesses? I'm not going to get into it right now, but I'll give you a hint. Who are the witnesses in chapter 5 of Revelation? Who are the witnesses in chapter 11? There must be witnesses to the covenant or to the covenant lawsuit, whatever is happening. If a covenant is being made or if a covenant lawsuit is being brought forth, then there will be witnesses to testify what has been done. You have seen what they have done. You have been there. I call the heavens, I call the earth to be a witness for me. See that? Witnesses have to do with how will God bring a case if the covenant is broken, and so on and so forth. Then finally, often there was a formal oath ceremony once all these 6 parts had been established. There is a oath ceremony, a sacrificial ceremony. Okay, so in other words, they'll slaughter animals, they'll sprinkle blood, and then a declaration will be made. This is the blood of the covenant, and so on and so forth. May this happen to me if I break the covenant. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick up in part number 2 from here, and we are going to go and see not only the covenant itself in these 6 parts in Exodus, but then we will go into the covenant lawsuits once the covenant was broken. And finally, the goal is to bring you to Revelation and to show you that Revelation is a covenant lawsuit. It is a covenant that has been broken that Revelation is adjudicating. So, hopefully that has begun an introduction, a good introduction, hopefully, of how the covenant of God was structured in a way that was familiar to the people of the Old Testament, and how God continued to utilize that structure to describe his relationship with his people and to bring about legal charges against his people when they broke his covenant, and to execute judgments against his people based on the broken covenant. Until part number 2, thank you very much for listening to me, and hopefully this will help you to begin to understand the Bible better. See you, and God bless you.